So we're going to start now? Yeah. But I want everyone to move right down to the front and I want to see the slides properly. Yeah.
Welcome this evening. Could I ask folks to kind of move down front? Because as Helen has a presentation, she'd really like to be able to see it. It's on a smaller screen. That would be greatly appreciated, and make sure that your cell phones are off. Yeah.
I bet it's on mine.
Well, I want to welcome you to this evening's program, the medical implications of living near a nuclear power plant. My name is Diane Turco, and I'm with Takedown Winters, and we are so honored to have Dr. Helen Caldicott here to speak this evening. She's going to educate the community on the dangers that people need to understand about living near a nuclear power plant. And it's so important that when you leave this event, that you go and talk to your neighbors, and you talk to everyone you know, and you share the information that Dr. Caldicott is going to talk about. Dr. Caldicott is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. She was co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, that give them the Nobel Prize. She is also the winner of the Lannan Prize for Cultural Freedom. She's also the author of many books. Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, and she has a new latest book, Crisis Without End. And we do have them for sale, and Helen will sign them at the end of the program. It's a must read. You need to read this and then pass it on and pass it on. Because everybody on this planet needs to read what Helen is saying. She's the premier person who's trying to save this planet, and we are so honored to have her tonight. Dr. Helen Caldicott.
Thank you, Diane. For those who are sitting in the back, you're not going to see the slides properly, so you make a decision. I'm going to start with the whiteboard, and I know you've probably heard this before, some of you haven't. Walk you through the medical effects of radiation, how radiation causes cancer, what sort of stuff is in this reactor just near you, and then I'll go on to specifically this area and the cancers that are occurring and what could happen if there was a meltdown and the like. Does that sound good or awful? I'll just get this. Okay, so there are 4 sorts of radiation, or 5, but I'll just do the 4. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Yep. Stand on this side. There are X-rays. Hands up those who've never had an X-ray. I don't believe you. Did you get your teeth X-rayed? Never get your teeth X-rayed unless you have a sore tooth. You do not need an X-ray every year from the dentist. We don't do that in Australia. And I found out you do it here because when there are plane crashes, they identify the victims from their records, their dental records. And I realised that, unnecessary X-rays are being done. My ex-husband was a radiologist, and they make a lot of money. And they buy this expensive equipment and don't get CT scans unless you absolutely have to. They give you a big dose of radiation. I think they've removed the radiation machines from the airports now, but I used to refuse to go through them. I'd have a full body search. I didn't care what they felt on my body, but I wasn't going through an X-ray machine. And radiation is cumulative. Each dose you get adds to your risk of getting cancer. Each X-ray you get. And people say, well, the industry says, there's background radiation, it's all fine. Well, background radiation induces probably about 30% of the cancers we see. And that background radiation comes from the cosmic rays of the sun, from radiation from the rocks in the earth, from radon gas and the like. It used to be 170 milligrams a year when I was in Boston, at Harvard. But now they've increased it to 300 just because they're including X-rays and stuff like that. So the industry has pushed up the level of background radiation, and then they say, well, it's all safe and you can be exposed to 300. they're not honest, and every time I debate with a nuclear power person, I find that they don't tell the truth. In other words, they lie. Then there's gamma radiation. Now, when the technician says breathe in, hold it, and runs out of the room and goes click, that's the only instant your genes can be damaged in a cell. You don't become radioactive. Likewise, when they give food very high doses of gamma radiation, which is like X-rays, the food does not become radioactive. They radiate the food to kill the microbes and the fungi, so it has a longer, quote, shelf life. But then radiolytic products are produced, some of which could be very dangerous. Gamma radiation is given off by material in the nuclear power plant, and it's like X-rays. Then there's alpha radiation, which is given off by plutonium and other such substances composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. So when that is emitted from an unstable atom, that's particulate, and if it hits a cell, it can damage it. And apparently there's plutonium and neptunium on your beaches, and around here, which should never ever have escaped from your reactor. This is a deadly material. Plutonium is so deadly that 1 millionth of a gram if inhaled will give you cancer. 1 millionth of a gram. The reactor, well, a normal 1,000 megawatt reactor, yours is 850, creates 500 pounds of plutonium a year. You need 10 pounds to make a bomb. And it's got a half-life of 24,400 years, and you multiply that by 10 to get its total radiological life, and it's about 500,000 years. So, in fact, nuclear reactors are bomb factories, and any country that buys a nuclear reactor has a bomb factory, not just now, but for the rest of time. Japan has 40 tons of plutonium stockpile. Within weeks, Japan could become a nuclear nation. And who helped give Japan the plutonium? You guys. Yes. Likewise, you supplied Saddam Hussein with the chemical weapons that they're just finding now. And Rumsfeld stood and watched with Hussein as they were killing the Kurds with chemical weapons years ago. The next one is beta radiation, which is just an electron shot off from the unstable atom, and that produces the same sort of damage. So how does radiation cause cancer and genetic abnormalities? Incidentally, my specialty is cystic fibrosis, the most common genetic fatal disease of childhood. And there are about 2,600 such diseases now described, like diabetes, hemochromatosis, inborn errors of metabolism, phenylketonuria, dwarfism, I could go on and on and on. And nuclear power will, over time, increase the incidence of genetic diseases in all species, not just us, because all species have genes. Now, how does radiation damage the gene? Well, in every cell, there are chromosomes, and radiosome chromosomes are genes. So, in every cell, and this is simplistic, but is a gene called a regulatory gene. And it regulates the rate at which cells reproduce. So if an alpha particle, got it, hits the regulatory gene and the cell does not die, or an X-ray does, or a beta particle, or gamma radiation, the gene, if the cell doesn't die, the DNA molecule is changed by a chemical. And it will sit undisturbed for years and years and years, and you won't know that you've had a genetic mutation. You won't know you've been damaged by radiation, then you feel a lump in your breast, or you cough up some blood, and you go to the doctor, and you need an X-ray then, and you've got lung cancer, breast cancer, whatever. And the cancer doesn't wear a little flag saying what made it. So we don't know which cancers are made by what, but we do know that radiation is a potent cause of cancer. And what we should be doing, instead of all wearing pink ribbons and, for breast cancer, we can't cure most cancers. We can cure some childhood cancers. We can alleviate some adult cancers, but the treatment for cancer is hideous. We, almost kill a patient as we're trying to kill a cancer. And so what we must do is prevent it. The dictum says if you have an incurable disease, you must prevent it. And these nuclear power plants are cancer factories, as well as bomb factories, because they're full of radioactive elements that concentrate in the food chain and get into human bodies and food. So once regulatory gene is damaged, one day the cell starts dividing in an unregulated way and produces trillions of cells, and that's a cancer. The cancer cells tend to be very virulent, and they invade blood vessels and lymph vessels, and one cell might migrate from the colon up to the brain, and you get second cancers, and that's called metastases. And so the cancer is like a parasite, and it uses up the energy of the body. You see a cancer patient as a withering before your very eyes, and when the cancer patient dies, so does the cancer. And we're really not good at treating cancer, therefore prevention is a cure. It's like polio. We couldn't prevent polio until Jonas Salk, who I knew, and John Enders at Harvard discovered the polio virus, and then we immunised people so we don't have polio. You've been watching the Roosevelt series and FDR and how he got polio, which was so tragic. Anyway, so that's how cancer causes disease. Also, in the most important organs of the body, what are the most important organs of the body? What? Liver? No. No. No.
Sex?
Yeah. Sex. Testicles and ovaries. Because we're really here biologically for one reason, we're here to reproduce. That's what we're really here for. Once we've reproduced, we've done our job. And then all the rest is gravy. So, the testicles and ovaries, so here's a sperm, and here's an egg, they're big. But the sperm and egg only have half the number of chromosomes and genes, so when the sperm and egg unite, you get a diploid number, the normal number. Now, all of these genes are important, and if any mutation occurs in any of these genes, you can produce cystic fibrosis. And 1 in 25 white people carry the gene for cystic fibrosis. It's quite common. I've been walking around the world for years saying we all carry several hundred genes for disease. So, guess what? My son recently was diagnosed with hemochromatosis, which comes from a gene from my ex-husband and me. So I carry a gene for a very serious disease, which is an iron metabolism deficit. So iron collects in the heart and the liver, so you get cirrhosis and cardiac abnormalities. And Philip gets venesected or bled a couple of litres every month to keep his iron levels low. So I've become a walking example of what I've been talking about all these years, and goodness knows how many other nasty genes I carry that could be passed on to future generations. So that's how cancer is caused, and that's how genetic disease is caused. Now, what are the things in nuclear power plants? Well, I might start with the slides now and demonstrate to you. This is a terrible map. I mean, if it was big, you'd see it better, but this is a map of Europe. I don't know where this was supposed to come. Oh, there it is. So this is Europe, and I'll just move the pointer over. I don't know if you can see it. Those in the front will see it. But here is Chernobyl, just there. And then if you go, the very dark red areas here are areas where people can't live. They're exclusion zones because the radiation is so intense that they would die. But if you look carefully here, Sweden got a hell of a fallout, and in fact, Chernobyl was first picked up in Sweden when they were suddenly measuring the radiation, and Gorbachev denied it, and the government in Russia denied it for 10 days. But it spread everywhere. Finland got a hell of a fallout, Norway. There are farms in England now that still, their lambs are so full of cesium they can't be sold on the market. Turkey got a huge amount, and Turkey's not illustrated in this map. Do not buy Turkish apricots, do not buy Turkish hazelnuts. Most of your hazelnuts that flavour your coffee, etc., come from Turkey. The Turks were so annoyed with Russia after this happened, they picked all the radioactive tea and sent it off to Russia so they could drink the radioactive tea. However, radiation lasts for a long time. Cesium lasts for 600 years, cesium-137. And this is only a map, really, of cesium all over Europe. So one stupid man in the middle of the night did a stupid experiment, blew the reactor up, and it contaminated a whole continent. Now you're sitting right next to Pilgrim. And this could easily happen tonight. Pilgrim is an old reactor. It's been allowed to function for another 20 years, although it's falling apart. It has a lot of serious mishaps. And you know, you might be at home and you might have on NPR or you might not, but you know, sometimes you hear, ooh, this is just a test of the emergency system. Well, you might hear, ooh, there's been a meltdown at Pilgrim. And if you watch the TMI accident in Pennsylvania, they said, yes, we know what we're doing, and yes, we have it under control. He was lying the whole time. There had been a partial meltdown there. And this could happen here tonight or next week, although the judge prevented me testifying today at the trial because the papers weren't put in early enough. Anyway, so that's an illustration of, you know, there's no other form of electricity production that can contaminate a whole continent. And that will remain radioactive for hundreds or thousands of years. There's been a book put out by the New York Academy of Sciences called Chernobyl, where doctors all over Europe have assessed their patients on the ground, and there are all sorts of diseases occurring. Cataracts, very high incidence of cataracts to the eye. Diabetes now is common because cesium concentrates in the pancreas where insulin is made. Children dying of sudden heart attacks. Very early premature aging in little children who are getting heart disease and the like. Thyroid cancers, huge increases in cancer. And it's estimated now, by now, over 1 million have died from this one result. That's what nuclear power is. It's a killer. It's a killer. And you've got one right in the middle of your area. And what has to happen is it has to be shut down, and you've got a fuel pool full of really radioactive fuel rods on the roof of that reactor, which is the same design as the Fukushima reactors. And I know the 3 GE engineers who designed those reactors in Fukushima and here, and they resigned in '75 because they said they were so dangerous. And they testified before Congress, but nothing changed. So you've got a Mark I GE reactor with a fuel pool full of highly radioactive fuel on the roof, and the roof over it is sort of like the roof you put on the top of a Target, something like that. You have Target here, don't you? Or what else do you have? You know, any of those box stores. So it's not going to protect you. And if there's a loss of coolant in that cooling pool, which you have to keep circulating the water all the time, then the cooling pool could well catch fire. And it could well reach critical mass because the cooling pool was only designed to hold, let me see, what? Was designed to hold 880 fuel assemblies. Now, what's a fuel assembly? A fuel rod is 12 feet long and half an inch thick. And if you stand just near a spent fuel rod out of the reactor, you'll die within 2 weeks with your hair falling out, vomiting and bleeding to death from acute radiation sickness. So much gamma radiation is given off from the fuel rod. So it's got 880 assemblies, but in the assemblies are 179 to 264 rods in each assembly. Okay? But, and so they've allowed the fuel assemblies. You've got now 2,320 assemblies, and you're allowed to increase it to 3,859. Well, that's all very well and good, but they're re-racking them, putting them much, much closer together, which means there could be a meltdown in the fuel pool. A meltdown in the fuel pool. And you're sitting on top of this. It's almost more dangerous than the reactor itself. No one talks about that. Look at the audience tonight. I've come to Plymouth to try and educate the dear people of Plymouth about the dangers with which they're living, and they haven't come. Well, how do we get to them? I mean, I can't tell you how frustrated I am as a physician and a paediatrician to know that we can't get through to the people of Plymouth and just teach them basic medical facts. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide, please. Well, you mightn't see this too well either, but this is Fukushima before the tsunami and after the tsunami, and there were 4 explosions, one of them a nuclear explosion.
Sorry.
What happened to you? We've lost the plot.
It blew up.
Don't trust technology, nor human beings, because we're fallible, and the technology is as fallible as are we. I will say that your reactor has no off-site monitoring. In other words, they've got a bit of monitoring for radiation at the site, but you know, at the boundary or beyond, they're not measuring radiation at all. Your reactor uses nearly 1 million gallons of water a minute from the bay. That water goes back into the bay relatively radioactive with tritium in it. So what's tritium? Tritium is radioactive hydrogen, H3. And the industry said, oh, it's only hydrogen, it's only radioactive hydrogen. It combines with oxygen to form tritiated water, and tritium concentrates in the fish and the seaweed, becomes organically bound, and about 10% of what you eat becomes organically bound in our bodies. Tritium is only a beta emitter, and they say, well, beta's not too bad, but tritium can be absorbed through the skin. So if you are living near Pilgrim and there's a fog, you can't operate a reactor without tritium continually being released because the only element that blocks the release of tritium is gold. So all reactors release tritium all the time, and your reactor's been emitting 64 curies in 2013, over 1 year. A curie is 37 billion becquerels. What's a becquerel? A becquerel is a disintegration per minute. So one disintegration hitting a cell and damaging the gene will do it. 37 billion, Curie is 37 billion becquerels, and they're emitting 64 curies of tritium a year. And so if you're immersed in the fog, the tritium goes straight through your skin. Nothing gets through the skin. It's very protective, but tritium goes through. You can inhale it. It might be in the vegetables you grow. Don't grow vegetables here. Don't grow apples. Don't grow fruit, because it will be concentrating the tritium. Carbon-14 gets out too. Now, carbon-14 is part of the DNA molecule. Very dangerous, lasts a hell of a long time. But your reactor's been dangerous because it had perforated fuel rods which allowed plutonium and neptunium to get out and strontium-90 into your environment. And they hang around for thousands of years. And children play on the beach. Children are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to radiation than adults. Old people are more sensitive than young people. Fetuses are thousands of times more sensitive. One X-ray to the pregnant abdomen doubles the incidence of leukemia. We know that. So you're living in a very dangerous area, and I wouldn't live here. And I look up at these pilgrims, you know, they had such hope. And in Australia, we're a bit rude, but I'd say they've buggered it up. You know, the great hope that you once had with the pilgrims, putting a death machine in the middle of Plymouth is really insane. It is said that the emissions data that they provide is unreliable, and the most emissions occur when they're refueling. They shut the reactor down, they pull out the fuel rods, and that's when the emissions are greatest of all sorts of isotopes. And then what they do is they take that emission that day or those 2 days and average it out over the whole year, so each day doesn't look very much. But if you're in the vicinity of the reactor when it's being refueled, that's when you can inhale radioactive iodine, which will give you thyroid cancer, a beta and a gamma emitter. That's when the strontium-90 can get into your milk, concentrate in the milk, and get into breast milk. And as it passes through the breast, if you're lactating, it can cause breast cancer and get into the baby, into its bones, and cause bone cancer or leukemia, because white blood cells are made in the bone marrow. So you're in a very dangerous predicament. The workers, the temporary workers here are not followed up. We don't know what their health effects are. There's a high incidence, and has been, of leukemia in this population in Plymouth. Apparently, the Plymouth County has the highest cancer incidence in Massachusetts, and Cape Cod on the whole has the second highest. You'd have to say it's because of the nuclear reactor. The Germans studied 16 of their old reactors and looked at children under the age of 5 living less than 2 miles from the reactor, and the children under the age of 5 had double the incidence of leukemia and a very high incidence of solid cancers. And that data was confirmed by another study in France and another study in Britain. So it's dangerous to have children living near a reactor. And they're probably getting leukemia and cancer from tritium or carbon-14, who knows? The infant mortality in 1974 to 76, when the reactor was started, was high, and the infant mortality is increased after nuclear radiation affects the fetus. What else? You're very vulnerable to earthquakes here, apparently, but think of global warming. You know, there are hurricanes occurring everywhere now. One just a typhoon passed over Fukushima recently, and the output of radiation into the Pacific was very big, and it's increasing all the time because there are 3 molten cores in the Earth with water rushing over them and mixing with the radioactive isotopes. 300 to 400 tons a day are pouring into the Pacific and have been of very highly radioactive water, have been since the accident occurred 3.5 years ago. So I wouldn't eat the fish that were caught here in the bay, because you don't know what isotopes they're emptying out with the water. They empty out stuff called sludge too, every now and then to clean the pipes with various isotopes in them. But as the sea levels rise and the storms get bigger and the waves get bigger, that reactor could be flooded, like at Fukushima. Because what happened at Fukushima, there was an earthquake, great earthquake, and then in came a tsunami. The tsunami was 45 feet high, and it literally went over the walls of the reactor. Because of the earthquake, they lost their external power supply, which supplied 1 million gallons of water per minute to each reactor. But because they knew that could happen, they had huge diesel generators beneath the reactors. But then in came the tsunami and drowned the diesel generators, and they lost their power supply to the pumps. So they were running up to their cars to get their car batteries to try and fuel the pumps. But what happened was, within hours, units 1, 2 and 3 started to melt. 100 tons of very hot fission uranium started to melt through 6 inches of steel, down like a molten larval radioactive sludge onto the floor of the containment vessel, and they think that they might have, these 100 tons, they're called coriums, of radioactive lava may have penetrated into the earth. And that's what the nuclear industry calls the China syndrome. That could happen here. So if there's an earthquake, or just an ordinary huge wave, and you lose your external power supply, which you can, with blizzards and the like, you could have a meltdown easily. Or there are terrorists. Now, we're worried about terrorists, aren't we? Ooh, ISIS, ooh. Everyone has to be checked for terrorism. You know who the real terrorists are? Russia and America. Russia's got retargeted with over 1,000 hydrogen bombs, 40 on New York, 60 on Washington, and Putin's put his weapons on a higher than normal state of alert because of the Ukraine. You can bet your bottom dollar if Putin has, you have too. And so you've targeted all cities and factories in China and Russia, and they've targeted you in Canada and Australia and Japan and Europe and England. So if there's a nuclear war tonight, because Putin gets upset or there's anxiety, on 9/11 they took your weapons, hydrogen bombs, to the highest state of nuclear alert, because they didn't know what was happening because of the international anxiety. So if you have a nuclear war, that's the end of most life on Earth. And you're targeted. I mean, all the nuclear reactors are targeted too. Can you imagine? Huge, colossal conflagrations and fires and black smoke shot up in the atmosphere, covering the Earth with a cloud so thick it blocks out the sun for 10 years and induces a short ice age, and we'll all freeze to death in the dark. Nuclear winter. So who are the real terrorists threatening us at every moment of every day? It's beyond my imagination, and we say it's for national security. That's absolute rot. National security that will all kill us ourselves if we don't like the Russians, or the Russians all kill us, you know. I mean, it's madness. And you can see these neocons in Washington, like, what's his name, McCain, charging along as if he's on his horse, you know, their chest sticking out with their swords, and they still think the same way about war as they thought when you know, generations ago. But they use the nuclear weapons now, which will destroy life on Earth. And I once asked Carl Sagan, who's a friend of mine, do you think there's life in the universe? And he paused for a long time. And he said no. And I said, why? And he said, because if any species had reached our stage of evolution, they would have destroyed themselves. So I'm having a conference at the New York Academy of Medicine at the end of February called The Dynamics of Possible Nuclear Extinction, and going through all of this. Stephen Hawking now thinks computers within 10 years could easily start a nuclear war themselves. I've got off the track, but it's all the same, because they started a peaceful atom in America, according to the Pentagon, to allay your anxiety. So, you know, although we've got nuclear weapons that can kill us all and you hide under your desk and practice duck and cover, in fact, there's a really good thing about nuclear power. It's all great, really, because it's peaceful. And that was Eisenhower who started that. Let's have the next slide, can we? Will it move?
Here we go.
Oh, well, that just shows the damage reactor. Okay, next. Well, this is the radiation that came from there in the first few days. And the ambient levels of radiation in Seattle went up 40,000 times above normal. These reactors are very, very vulnerable. They're very damaged. If there's an earthquake greater than 7 again, which is very possible, Building 3 could collapse, taking a huge cooling pool down, and it would catch fire, causing a radioactive volcano. And it would hit molten corium at the bottom. God knows what would happen. I know Naoto Kan, the Prime Minister in charge of Japan during the accident, and he was talking about having to evacuate Tokyo. And I want you to apply what I'm saying now to you here. There were 4 reactors down the coast in Fukushima-type. There were 6 reactors here, and luckily the accident occurred on Friday afternoon when the full staff were there. But if it had occurred at night on Friday, there would have been only 100 staff here and at Daini, and that would have, as David Suzuki in Canada said, that would have meant bye-bye Japan. And much of the Northern Hemisphere, because you're right in the prevailing winds that come all over you. We even got plutonium and americium in Boston, where my grandchildren are. Next slide, please. Well, this just shows the dispersion initially on the 18th of March, 7 days afterwards, just hitting now the west coast. And then 21st of March, it occurred on the 11th. 10 days later, it covers pretty well the United States and Canada, and then starts moving across the Atlantic. And then the whole of the northern hemisphere gets affected next. Well, what happened was that for the first 2 days, the wind was blowing from east to west, and so it blew towards you, but then it changed and blew over northwest Japan, and it's very heavily populated. And the Japanese government knew where the radiation was going, and so did the Americans, because they were flying planes measuring it all the time, but they didn't tell the people because they didn't want to create panic. Now what happens if it's a meltdown here? You won't be told probably, and they say, oh, well, it will evacuate you. How? How are you going to get off Cape Cod? Evacuate your well, someone said swim east. But you know, what about the children in the schools and everyone in panic, wanting to pick their children up and listening to the radio and, you know, not wanting to open the windows to breathe in the radioactive air, and it'll be just total pandemonium. And you'll all be exposed. Next slide. That's all. Let's move on. No, that's yeah. Nuclides to watch. Well, we know that radioactive iodine has a half-life of 8 days and lasts about 6 weeks. And iodine only goes to the thyroid, so you all have to have potassium iodide tablets in your medicine cabinet. So if you hear there is an accident, take it immediately, because if you take it, after the plume has moved over you and you've inhaled the radiation, it's too late because the radioactive ion goes to your thyroid. But if you take potassium iodide, which is inert, it becomes saturated, the thyroid, and it will not take up the radioactive iodine. But if you have potassium iodide, it doesn't protect you from anything else. So here's cesium-137, half-life 30 years, lasts for 600 years. Beta and gamma, strontium-90, half-life 30 years, lasts for 600 years. Cesium goes into heart muscle, brain, testicles, ovaries, and muscle. It causes rhabdomyosarcomas. Plutonium, half-life, well that's plutonium-241. 239, which is what you make the bombs from, half-life 24,400 years, and highly carcinogenic. Next. This is Tokyo. It's interesting. In July, these are the azaleas, and they're all dying. And that's the height of summer in Japan, in Tokyo. And these are the ginkgo leaves, and you can see the spots on them from radiation being deposited. Many parts of Tokyo are more radioactive than areas, the exclusion zones around Chernobyl. And doctors are seeing children with very low blood counts, white blood counts, low platelet counts, nosebleeds, all sorts of things, but the doctors have been told not to tell their patients that their symptoms are related to radiation. The media is not allowed to cover it, and if they do cover it in Japan, they could go to jail for 10 years. They've just passed the secrecy law. America is encouraging Japan to reopen their 54 reactors because, look, it's big business. How much does energy make per day? Here, it makes $1 million by selling electricity to your detriment. They are criminals. They're long-term murderers, let's be frank. I speak now as a doctor. They're long-term murderers. And they're continually emitting radiation into your water, into your food, into your air. And then we can come to a devastating accident. Next. Yeah. Well, this is children, this is Chernobyl. And you won't see this very clearly, but here are two children severely retarded. Here's a child with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, he's got 5 toes, but he's got elephantiasis and totally swollen. Here's a child with an abnormal eye. There are homes full of severely deformed children around Chernobyl, such that we've never seen in the history of paediatrics before, because the developing fetus in the first 3 months of life gets all its limbs and its heart and everything. After 3 months, it grows in size. So if you're irradiated and you're pregnant in the first 3 months, severe deformities can occur. And also, if you get a bit of plutonium through the placenta, and it does cross the placenta into the developing embryo, it can kill a cell that's going to form the left arm, like thalidomide did. Remember? Children were born with no limbs, no legs, or I had a kid who drove a tractor on my property in Australia. He had no arms. And he ran his radio station. It was called Big Toe Radio Station. He did everything with his toes. Next. Well, this is the cover of the Chernobyl book. And these are trees. You can see the growth rings here, and then Chernobyl happened. And the growth rings hardly happened. Very, very dense wood. And that's a very good illustration. And this is the Chernobyl book, put together by a lovely guy called Yabakov. And he gave a testimony at my conference last year at the New York Academy of Medicine. So if you get this book, you can read what Yabakov said about Chernobyl. Next. Oh, this is a study I commissioned for carbon-free, nuclear-free. In fact, America could be carbon-free, nuclear-free by 2030. Why don't you have solar panels on every house? Why don't you become independent from these corporations? Why don't you have, well, you've got 1 or 2 windmills. I mean, they're just token symbols. Why did Teddy Kennedy block their windmills, in Hyannis? Why didn't Teddy, who I knew really well and was very close to, why didn't he close down Pilgrim? Well, I didn't get to him enough, and then he died. Anyway, now there's a wonderful evolutionary biologist called Tim Mousseau. He's studying the barn swallows in the exclusion zones of Chernobyl and Fukushima. Very dangerous for him. But these are the mutations. These little white feathers here, they're mutations. I don't know, there's a mutation there, there's a tumour here, there's a very crooked beak here, and the tail feathers are very aberrant. And that's what happens to barn swallows, and that's what happens to humans. But we examine our drugs by injecting them into animals first to see if they're safe, and then we can use them or we don't. What happens to animals happens to us because we're all the same biological systems. Next. These are the cataracts he's found in the barn swallows. Look at them. And this is what lots of cataracts around Chernobyl and in Europe, Belarus, the Ukraine. Incidentally, the Ukraine, where that war's going on, has 15 reactors, including Chernobyl. The Ukraine is very radioactive, lots of cancers there. The food's radioactive in many areas. And a conventional war could melt down a nuclear reactor in the Ukraine and then grow another Chernobyl. No one talks about that either. The politicians are out to lunch. Either they don't know or they're not using their intelligence. But they should be informed. But you know, most politicians are scientifically and medically illiterate. And we elect them, but what we don't understand is that we are their leaders and they are our representatives. And unless we make them do what we want them to do, we don't have a democracy. Obama isn't your leader, you're his leaders. But you have to get out there and use your bodies and threaten them and door knock in the electorate and say, unless you do what we want, we'll make sure you're not elected. Well, this is a map of Europe. You can hardly see it, but I mean, Europe is covered with nuclear reactors. Britain's crazy. France is even crazier. I've got a French son-in-law who's a count. I was pretty crazy. My grandchildren are sort of half French and they're a bit crazy too. Anyway, my daughter's a countess. You can hardly imagine a less likely countess. Anyway, that's Europe. So you can't have a war in a country that's got nuclear power plants. Do you see? You can't have a conventional war. That's what's happening in Ukraine. This is a very deformed tomato grown near Fukushima. You don't see it very well, but it's very deformed, and that's mutation. Next. Now, what I'm going to do is walk you down through these. These are all the. You only hear about cesium, you hear about plutonium, you hear about tritium. But do you know that all of these radioactive elements are in your reactor? All of them. And if there's a meltdown, they all get out. I'll just walk you down quickly. Tritium, beryllium, carbon, silicon, phosphorus, they're all radioactive. And they all go to different organs in the body. And radiation can cause cancer in every organ of the body. Sulfur, chlorine, argon, potassium, calcium, scandium, vanadium, magnesium, iron, cobalt, nickel, zinc. Next. Niobium, molybdenum, technetium, rhodium, silver, cadmium, indium, tin, go on. The cows in Fukushima have very high levels of tin, radioactive tin in their flesh. Bismuth, polonium, radon, francium, radium, actinium, thorium, protium, uranium, neptunium. These are the really nasty ones. Plutonium, americium, curium, named after Madame Curie, who died of cancer, beryllium, californium, and the like. They're all in your reactors, and they only talk about a couple of them. So I think that's the end. I think I'll stop now. I'm getting really hot. And I bet you've got some questions, because question time is usually the most interesting.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, before we start the questions, I just want to recognize Matt Patrick. Where are you, Matt? Matt Patrick is here. He's running for state rep, and thank you. Hey, did you want to say anything, Matt?
God, it's pretty daunting stuff, and I've it's almost like I've. Yeah, it's very daunting to hear all this, and you realize that you've heard it before, and you're just getting reminded again. And we do like to think, well, there are 500 people working there. We may want to keep it working, keep the jobs there, but it's really too much of a trade-off, and we can't even hedge that going forward. So thank you, Doctor, for coming here. And my only question is, she said, you know, what do we do? Even after we shut these things down, we're not going to be able to move this stuff away.
Yeah, and we need to have dry storage of spent fuel rods, which is a bit safer than having them in that cooling pool above the ground. But I'm not sure politically how you shut them down. See, I was in court today and the judge wouldn't let me testify because the papers were produced too late or some absolute legal rhubarb. I mean, they have to be shut down. They have from a medical perspective, and I guess the physician should be leading this. There are enough people in this room to shut it down. No one's ever told me what to do, I just kind of know. The media are just interested in if they see a bit of blood or, you know. I can tell you a few things I've done, but to attract the media, but maybe I won't tell you. Yeah, I mean, it's up to the politicians. I know Ed Markey really well. Barbara Box is doing a good job, but Ed needs to step out as a senator now, because he's been against nuclear power since he was a little boy, delivering milk for his father, which had radiation in it from the nuclear tests, so he's always known about it. Yeah. If I can help you in any way, please, I'm available.
Doctor, have you?
No, it's not, you need to speak up. That's for the camera here.
Doctor, have you heard about these two MIT graduates, a woman and a man, who have, I saw this, or I saw it on television, or I read it, where they have a new method of using the spent rods to generate nuclear and to take care of that waste issue.
I have, and it's a lie.
It's a lie. Okay.
Yeah, what they do is, you see, plutonium lasts for all that time. So they get the spent fuel rods from Pilgrim and they chop them up by remote control and they dissolve them in concentrated nitric acid. And from that incredibly toxic radioactive solution, they precipitate out the plutonium, which is what they did to make all the bombs. You know, America made 77,000 hydrogen bombs during the Cold War. And then that plutonium is made into fuel rods again. Instead of using uranium, they're using plutonium. And they put that in a reactor, but what you have to use as a coolant is not water, but liquid sodium. And if any of you have done chemistry, you'll know that liquid sodium, when exposed to air or water, explodes. So you've got a very explosive mix, and 10 pounds of plutonium is critical mass. So you put tons of plutonium in, there could be a leak in the pipe, you lose your coolant, and you have a massive, massive plutonium explosion, scattering plutonium to the four winds, tons of it, number one. Number two, only 9% of the plutonium fissions into cesium that only lasts 600 years, and strontium that only lasts 600 years, and all the other isotopes I showed you. So in fact, you don't get rid of much plutonium, and you produce deadly isotopes that last for generations. And what's more, if you put a blanket of uranium-235 around this reactor, U-35 captures neutrons and turns to instant plutonium, so you breed it, so you get more plutonium out than you fission. These are insane machines, and these people have no right to talk like this. And most physicists do not understand radiation biology or genetics or medicine at all, which makes me cross.
Maybe that's why I haven't heard any more about it.
Well, no, it's in the literature. They're talking about small modular reactors and that sort of thing. I mean, these guys are absolutely obsessed with, E equals mc squared. Energy by splitting an atom is the energy inside the sun. Somehow it appeals to some of their reptilian midbrains that have a toxic reaction to testosterone, and, it really gets them. I mean, if you look at the Pentagon's language, they say when there's a nuclear explosion, they say it's like one big orgasmic wump. They use a lot of sexual terminology in the weapons language in the Pentagon. Missile erectors, soft laydown, deep penetration. They do, and I wrote about that in my book, Missile Enemy. They didn't like it, but and people dying, that's just collateral damage, but you kill the missiles, but millions or billions dying, that's just not really relevant. Yeah.
What's going on with the spent uranium shells that they used in the Middle East? Can you talk about that for a second?
Uranium, it's called depleted uranium, only because when you mine uranium, only 0.7% is uranium-235, which is the fissionable isotope. And it must be enriched to 3%. And, you've had 2 huge coal-fire plants to enrich uranium. They say it doesn't produce global warming, which is a lie too. So the stuff left behind is uranium-238. And it's waste. It's all over the place in huge barrels and dumps and everything. It's free. It's 1.7 times more dense than lead, and its momentum equals mass by velocity. If you have a big mass and a very high velocity, you get a tremendous penetration of the steel of the tanks. So it penetrates the tank like a hot knife through butter. But when it hits the tank, 80% of it burns, producing tiny aerosolized particles of 5 microns in diameter that can be inhaled into the terminal air passages. That stuff is lying around in the desert, in the sand, blown up by the winds, and the uranium also concentrates in the milk, and the kids play in these destroyed tanks. There was such a tank in Kuwait, and the Kuwaitis are allies, so they made you guys dig it up and take it and bury it in a huge concrete bunker. I don't know, in Savannah River or somewhere, but there are tanks destroyed all over Iraq. And 360 tons of the stuff was used in Basra, and the doctors there quite soon noticed a high incidence of cancer in the children and very deformed babies. Women are giving birth to 2-headed babies and sort of jellyfish babies, and so severe, I think 13% of all births now are severe deformities, that the doctors have told the women to stop having babies. But the half-life of uranium-238 is 4.5 billion years. So it is a nuclear war that America is conducting there, contaminating the cradle of civilization where arithmetic began, law began, writing began, and the like. Then Fallujah, they used a hell of a lot there too, and they're seeing the same abnormalities and pathologies within mostly the children. But the birth defects are just horrendous, and they're documented. I've seen lots of photographs. So that has to be stopped. I wrote an article for the New York Times about this 10 years ago, and they said, we are unable to publish this. Who told them they couldn't? The Pentagon, I suppose. But why? I thought all the news that's fit to print, I thought you had a free press here. So it has to get out, and maybe you could be one of the people who publicise it. Jim, what's the congressman's name from Washington State? He's a doctor. Jim, I think. McDermott, yeah. I've talked to him about it. I talked to Teddy Kennedy too, but he was too busy really to listen that day. It's an absolute disgrace. Well, it's more, and America's selling these weapons all around the world. I've been to the factory where they're made in Tennessee, and they use them in Bosnia, they use them in Afghanistan.
Susan here.
On Cape Cod, we are given potassium iodine. We're given 2 of them, and we're expected to shelter in place and then be relocated. Is that an adequate number to receive?
2. Yeah, 2 would block it if you take it before the plume gets to you and before you inhale the radioactive iodine, yes, but it protects nothing else. All the other isotopes can get into your body and do terrible damage. Yeah.
I can speak up now.
Yeah, this is for the
I
camera.
wonder if you could talk about the thorium reactor that's been foisted as the answer to the new nuclear.
Thorium, I wrote an article about thorium, and it's in the Huffington Post. It's also on my webpage. I'll give you my card later, HelenCaldicott.Foundation.org. Thorium is ubiquitous, more so than uranium in the Earth's crust, but it's not fissionable. So you have to mix the thorium with uranium-235, which you have to enrich up to 3%. And the uranium-235 starts to fission the thorium and produce uranium-233 and uranium-232. And that takes quite a long time. The 233 is fissionable. So then you take all the rods out and you reprocess it to get out uranium-233 you just produced, and then you could have more reactors. The uranium-232 though is incredibly toxic, so radioactive no one can get near it, and you can't really handle the spent fuel. B, it's just economically out of the question. But it's these warriors who, they're absolutely obsessed with answers to problems that have been induced by technology by using more technology. And the simple answers are here. Yeah. We have to take them on full frontal. They actually need their bottoms smacked. That's why we run like Maggie Thatcher, because the boys were all beaten in public schools in England.
Hi, I had a question. You talked about our vulnerability to a terrorist attack.
Yeah.
How vulnerable do you think we are in terms of our power plants, in terms of the power grid and interruption to the power grid and the consequences of that?
Well, you're very vulnerable to interruption of the power grid, and goodness knows what's going to happen as global warming increases and more blizzards and cyclones and heavens knows what. But the terrorists who flew into the World Trade Towers had targeted the 2 Indian Point reactors 35 miles from Manhattan, and they didn't fly into them because they thought they were protected by missiles, but they weren't. If they had, that would have been the end of the financial centre of the world. So you're very vulnerable. Totally. This one back off the line. No, there's one more.
Thank you, first of all, Doctor, for coming. We certainly do appreciate it. We need all the help we can get here. I want to ask a question. Is cystic fibrosis caused by radiation?
I tried to point out that all genetic diseases that can be caused by radiation, yes, and so we will see, well, we'll be dead, but over generations, the incidence of genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, like diabetes, like hemochromatosis, increase in frequency down the generations. And let me explain evolution. Background radiation caused evolution, so there are mutations, so that fish develop lungs and birds develop wings. Most mutations are deleterious, they cause death and disease. Very few are advantageous to survive in a particular environment, and it takes millions or billions of years for evolution to occur. Most mutations are deleterious and cause disease. So over time, you will see, I mean, I say that nuclear power produces random compulsory genetic engineering. And not just in humans, but all species, moss, lichen, plants, birds, they all have genes too, and they all have genetic diseases and develop cancer. So we're desecrating the positive process of evolution, which, you know, is, some people think is God's creation. I happen to be a pantheist. I worship nature, and Pan was a god of nature, but many people do believe in God, and so what we're doing is desecrating the creation.
So if the cystic fibrosis person back in time, were they like exposed to some type, we'd have new plants then, exposed to some type of radiation in plants, I mean in the atmosphere?
Yeah, in background radiation.
Background radiation.
Background radiation continuously, 170 millirats a year. Coming from radon in your cellars, coming from gamma radiation from the rocks on the Earth, coming from cosmic radiation. Airline pilots get a lot of radiation in the air. They have a higher than normal incidence of melanoma. the women who work on the planes have a higher than normal incidence of breast cancer. Yeah, everywhere you get more radiation, there's a higher incidence of cancer. But you have to wait for generations to see genetic impacts, so that two recessive, I'll give you an example. You can't have blue eyes unless you have two blue-eyed genes. If you have a brown-eyed gene which is dominant and blue, you're going to have brown eyes. Or two brown-eyed genes you'll have. So here's a quiz. Two blue-eyed parents had a brown-eyed child. Where did the brown eyes come from? What? Yeah, the milk. So genetics can be very useful. But you see, you carry these recessive genes and you don't know you've got them until you mate with someone like cystic fibrosis who has the same gene. Yeah. And then it's a 1 in 4, I think, a toss-up each time. I once was at Children's Hospital where I worked. I was on the faculty at Harvard, and I saw an achondroplastic dwarf, you know, the ones with very short limbs and long trunks and big heads, married to a normal person. They're walking down the corridor. There are 5 children following in their footsteps. 4 were achondroplastic dwarfs, the children. Now that's a dominant gene, so it's 1 in 2 chance that that baby will have the disease. They just missed out.
Thank you so much.
This is a gentleman.
Oh, me?
Hello.
Well, I've been speaking recently, last year, about, I'm a little bit different than you, because you speak about the dangers of the actual chemicals, and I'm curious as if you feel, I mean, regardless of them operating, that you feel that they should be responsible for the protective equipment available, including the disaster unit, of having on hand the pills, the masks, in case of it, that they should be responsible for the people within the radius affected if the light bulb burns out, because light bulbs burn out, which was the reactor. Meaning, like, I've contacted.
Of course, they should have all the equipment protection.
I mean, I know that's what I personally stand for. I've tried to do some different proposals, gotten 100 signatures. You know, would you take a mask, you know, and then have an evacuation plan?
Well, when the workers go into very high radiation areas, do they wear protective clothing? Because they do. You know, if there's a fault in a pipe, I remember the radiation was so high that the welders could only stay there for a minute before they got their yearly dose of radiation. And so you had so many welders to go and fix the pipe. Some areas of the reactors are extremely radioactive, and I don't know if they keep records of your radiation exposure. I do know at Fukushima, the workers have been covering up their badges with lead. And also at Fukushima, the mafia, the Yakuza, are bringing up homeless people from the streets, mentally retarded people to run the reactors because they're running out of warm bodies. They need 3,000 people a day, and people are getting their doses of radiation have to stop. So where are they going to get all their workers from? This is an accident that is ongoing forever. They'll never get those molten cores. They'll never stop the water pouring into the Pacific.
I do apologize for having a question. I'll probably get your information.
Okay, thanks. Oh, I mean, you can contact me later.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if you had a response to Bill McKibben of 350.org seems to vacillate between acknowledging the dangers of radiation and then refusing to acknowledge that that's part of our
I
climate
interviewed
disaster.
Bill McKibben on my radio show. I had a radio show called If You Love This Planet for 3.5 years. And I got him to admit he was against nuclear power. He certainly doesn't stand strongly against it.
Why is that?
I don't know. It's taking money from me. I mean, I hate to suggest it, but why don't people stand up against this deadly, deadly, deadly technology? And I just would say what Einstein said years ago. He said the splitting of the atom changed everything, all reality, save man's mode of thinking. Thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. And this is what's happening right here in Plymouth. Yes.
Yes, I asked one of the candidates for governor why he supported the extension of the license, the Pilgrim license, until 2032 at the earliest. And he told me that he trusted the experts. And he placed a lot of trust in their decision making, and he would defer to them. I guess my question is, I believe it was in reference to the NRC and those experts. Has the NRC ever come into a nuclear plant de facto and said, that's it, we're taking a license, we're shutting you down? Everything that I see suggests that they running into financial issues, there's a small market, or the potential repairs are too expensive, and then they move on, and that's what causes the shutdown. It isn't the NRC coming in and asserting themselves and says their cumulative risk is too much.
And
What
the
is your
five
experience?
commissioners of the NRC, I know Alison Carlin quite well, who's the head. She's a geologist. I've watched the NRC in action, and the other commissioners are all pro-nuclear and come from the nuclear industry on the whole. So they just go along and support the nuclear industry. They're not protecting you.
They don't shut plants.
No, they're not protecting you. They're not there for your health and well-being. They're there for the health and well-being of the nuclear power industry. It's obscene. So you need a revolution, people. You know, we had a revolution in the 80s, because when I first came to America, most people said to me, I'd rather be dead than communist. I thought, I'd rather have a nuclear war than be red. I thought, this is psychotic. So I got together 23,000 physicians, and we started holding symposia about the medical effects of nuclear war. So the next day, the Boston Globe, the bishop, the archbishop in Boston got up and saw on the front page of the Globe, you know, the circles of destruction, like 5 miles from the epicenter, everyone's vaporized, turned into gas. 20 miles from the epicenter, everyone is lethally burnt or turned into missiles traveling at 100 miles an hour. A firestorm of 3,000 square miles, and they started to say, I don't think Jesus would approve of this. I'm being a bit facetious. And then the Catholic bishops produced a pastoral letter against nuclear war. The Methodist bishops did. I went to see the head of the Mormon church, he was 94 in Utah. They were going to base MX missiles travelling on trains. That was Reagan's idea. And I talked to him, they cancelled it. I met with Reagan for an hour report in the White House by myself and held his hand as he needed reassurance because he didn't know really anything. And at the end of 5 years of education, and it was education through the media, that Mrs. Brown in the supermarket getting Coke for her kids understood the dangers of nuclear war. 80% of people opposed nuclear weapons, and it brought an end to the Cold War with Gorbachev and Reagan working together. That was the second American Revolution. It was a revolution in thinking and action, peaceful, sagacious, Gandhian, done through education. Now it's the media that's determining the fate of the earth, and that's why this hall is practically empty. If the people of Plymouth knew about this, they'd all be here. See, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Green. I don't know how you, I mean, with Murdoch in charge, she's more and more powerful. And he initiated my career in Australia when I did the French tests. There are more questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is related to the consciousness of people, and I'm very interested in how we make that shift from fear. It seems like the entire country has been locked in fear of, in a way, what we have become as a nation. We have become a warring nation. The American way is, you know, the American government, the American motto in the world is the country that keeps on killing. And we're killing right now in Syria, and we support all the killing that goes on around the planet for our entire history. And the nuclear industry, to me, is the crown jewel of the war industry. And there's a great deal of deconstructing in our consciousness, the way we think, as you were just mentioning, of what a nuclear power plant is actually for. And it is clear to me that it is not for generating electricity. It is clear to me that it is for generating warheads, war munitions that are in fact being deployed, which we have ample of.
No, they're not making warheads from nuclear power plants. They're not.
What are they doing with it? And can you help me figure that
Well,
part
they're just
out?
storing waste on 100 feet above the ground in what they call a swimming pool. And it has to be sort of isolated from the environment for a million years. a million years. No, I tried to explain, that comes from when they enrich the uranium-235 to 3%. Lots of uranium-238 is discarded, and that's what's called depleted uranium, because it's depleted of uranium-235. Okay? The other thing is that, you have socialised killing here. 50% of your discretionary tax dollars goes to the Pentagon killing, and the rest goes to nuclear power. So you have socialised killing and socialised nuclear power, but capitalism for all of you people. So we don't even have a free medical care like we have in Australia. We have the best medical care. I mean, fantastic, all free. And you deserve that. These are your tax dollars, and you're going to Lockheed Martin et al. And that has to stop. Now you say, well, what can we do? So you're talking about everyone else. The only person you can change, and this is the last question, the only person you can change is you. I came to this country a young doctor. I was at Harvard. I was an alien. That's bad. And I was a woman. That's bad. And no one really told me what to do. I kind of knew. And I started the Physicians for Social Responsibility. I really led kind of with Randy Forsberg, the revolution. And one person can be as powerful as the most powerful person who ever lived. And it's very easy to say aorta. You know, the aorta, the vessel that comes out of the heart. Well, in Australia, aorta fix the bridges. Aorta get rid of the bombs. Aorta do this. The aorta syndrome. Never use it. Never look at anyone else. The only person you can change is you, and by example, you will become a leader. Because people need leaders. And that's all I'm going to say.